And on the other side of the coin, texts written near and within the exile often focus less on communal and familial guilt for transgressions, but upon the individual for their guilt. You can note Ezekiel's break with centuries of communal and familial guilt, such that children can no longer inherit the sins of their fathers, something in direct contradiction to the Torah. What has emerged is a new focus on individuality. That weakening of the terrestrial family structure may have been one of those maybe one of the final forms of the compression, again, shrinking the size and scope of the archaic four-tiered divine family, focusing now more than ever on individual divine beings being worthy of worship. An individual divine being, like the individual tough dudes that survived all this. Again, is such a shift sufficient for monotheism? No, of course not. But like everything we've been discussing, it's just another social force lending in the direction of the theological overdetermination that will become accidental historical monotheism. Well, if the ancient Assyrians were the first among the peoples to come to the idea of a universal God through the process of universal empire building, though again we do find monotheistic rhetoric and perhaps even monotheism in the 14th century great hymn to the Aten by Akhenaten, way back in the 14th century being another early contender. The Judeans came upon the notion of a universal God through dialectical negation. Centuries of theological compression, cycles of theological suppression, the now exile left Judean theologians precious few theological options. Perhaps we can say that they were doomed to monotheism. A history of royal theology, now a kingship of ashes, Yahweh is forced to employ foreign kings to do his bidding. What other option is there? But ironically, this greatly expands the power of Yahweh. No longer the God King of the Judeans, but the God King of perhaps all God Kings, one God King to rule them all. With priest and king now powerless and eliminated, that royal theology shifted to a direct relationship of the people of Judea, or of Israel writ large. Israel becomes the more direct servant of the divine law, with individual responsibility now the ethical compass, much more so than familial or communal guilt and punishment, or the commune. But from these two negations arises a synthesis through concrete negation. The elevation of Yahweh as king over the Persians or the Egyptians implies a local negation of the operative power of those gods that underwrite those monarchies. If Yahweh is to be king over them, indeed over the entire olam, of the entire world cosmos, it is no longer enough that those gods are inferior to Yahweh in power. Henotheism isn't going to do the lifting here. Those other gods must be utterly negated as gods and indeed as beings at all. The radical universality of Yahweh logically implies the negation of all other divinities, and it appears that such a theology attains just such philosophical escape velocity from mere monotheistic rhetoric or henotheism or monolatry in the exilic theologian prophet of the writer of Isaiah 40 through 55. This section of Isaiah 40 through 55 has been recognized as a separate composition since at least the 18th century than the previous book composed in the 8th century BCE, what we call First Isaiah. The author of this Deutero-Isaiah is living in the exile, and scholars contend, and I frankly agree, is the best candidate for the development of primitive Judean monotheism. But how does this idea emerge? Precisely through a polemic with the very theological situation of the exile vis-a-vis the powers of those foreign gods who apparently now rule over the Judeans in exile. The clearest statements of this primitive monotheism appear in that polemical context, roughly in Isaiah 40 through 48 and 49 through 55. Specifically, those sections seem to inaugurate some core theological themes, like 1. That Yahweh is the creator of the cosmos and is in control of the present state of affairs, specifically using Cyrus as his anointed, or Moshiach, to direct worldly affairs. 2. Yahweh has specifically chosen Israel, rather than any king, as his servant upon the world. And 3. Israel should choose Yahweh because there is simply no other gods to choose from, as opposed to the vassal contract relationship of the Deuteronomistic theology, though of course that choice does involve some degree of redemption. Here it's a logical deduction. There are just no other gods but Yahweh. Pick Yahweh, not pick Yahweh because you get stuff. This positive theology, however, is built upon a larger religious polemic, a negation of what is around them. That polemic and the rhetorical and theological inversions that come along with it are aimed at a comparison of the aniconic Yahweh with the created idols of Marduk and Nabu. Recall that the Assyrians had assimilated Marduk to Ashur in their theological universalizing project. Now, however, with Babylonian Marduk, the ascendant deity in the regional world, and in some sense the best candidate for the greatest god of that time. Well, you come at the king, you best not miss. But in this polemic, and through powerful rhetorical negation, 2nd Isaiah increasingly negates themselves into a universal monotheism. As Smith points out so well, Yahweh is a God who creates the world and crafts human beings, while Marduk is the creation of hands, the craft work of human beings. Idol makers are afraid, while Israel is commanded not to fear. Israel's made the witness of Yahweh, while the idols, they have eyes, but they can't see anything. Israel said to know that Yahweh is God alone, whereas the idol makers know only their own handiwork. Like, you know you made that. That's not a god. Yahweh is glorified through Israel, while the idols are bedecked in mere human conceptions of beauty. The forest praised Yahweh, but its dead wood is only fit for idols, the same wood discarded and burned. The craft person declares that wood and stone are gods, but Yahweh declares that Israel is their servant. The idols are mute and cannot declare their choice of worldly servants. The immobile statues of Marduk and Nabu must be carried by beasts and humans, while Yahweh carries Israel and the world over, moving even King Cyrus by his command. In effect, the deeper the polemical attack upon the Babylonian gods, there is an inverse logical rejoinder for the very ontological status of Yahweh. The negation of the great gods of this time leaves little logical choice for the Judean theologian. The negation of their theological powerlessness and exile, the negation of the negation, must result, I think, in monotheism, not so much so because of the theologians' fancy or because their desire to be monotheists, but really because their options have simply all run out. Monotheism wasn't a theological choice born out of triumph or dramatic revelation, but a theological dead end born out of defeat, exile, and centuries of historical accidents.